Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, the novel, Chapter 12, An Ancient Find. Dr. Edwin Lindsay worked to cut his way to the temple he was searching for. When he was first approached about finding this temple a few weeks back, he wasn't sure about it. However, now that he was within mere feet of the temple that Paul Augustine had wanted him to find, he was excited. He swung his blade one more time and was thankful when he exposed the entrance to the temple. He put the blade into a protective sheath and entered the temple, saying to his companion, "This is it. You know, when you first presented the findings to me, I had my doubts. Now I'm glad I was wrong. This will be one of the greatest archaeological finds in history." He watched as Paul Augustine looked around, surprised that the old man had managed the 2-week trip. As he started to look around the room, he heard Paul say, "All these years, and I have searched, and here it was, hidden under the ancients' insidious magic." Something in Lindsay told him to worry, especially when he heard the tone in Paul's next words. "You've done very well, Dr. Lindsay. So well, I plan to give you an early bonus." He knew he had good reflexes. He sometimes needed them when exploring old ruins. Even before he heard the gunfire, he ducked and rolled behind the one pillar in the room. He also fished out his revolver and took a shot. He waited until Paul's gunfire stopped. As he waited, he heard Paul say, "Dr. Lindsay, you are a scholar, not a warrior. In that area, I have centuries of experience." He noticed that Paul's voice had changed as he spoke. He also noticed that the bullet that he had shot into Paul's arm hadn't bothered him in the least. Edwin waited for a moment and spun around the pillar and fired again. He then spun out of sight, but not before he saw Paul transform into a skeletal form. He was startled by the sight, but felt a wave of terror as he saw the one wall rise, and a huge creature, looking like the proverbial Grim Reaper, come walking in. He then heard what had been Paul say, "Guardians of Zelatoth, destroy him." It was also at that time he saw a green mist coating the floor. He also noticed that the room had now sealed, and Paul was nowhere to be seen. He quickly took aim at the creature and fired his gun again, and was stunned to see his bullets bounce right off of it. He ducked behind another pillar and got his shotgun ready. He didn't want to use it, knowing what the shotgun blasts might do to the walls, but he had no choice. He quickly loaded the shotgun and quickly moved out from behind the pillar. He was startled to be facing the creature, and terrified when it opened its cloak to reveal that it was actually 2 wings. He also noticed the scythe-like thing that was actually the creature's tail, and saw the tail was about to strike him. Before he stepped back, he saw the tail coming towards him. He was startled when he heard something striking metal, and noticed that the tail had been stopped by a sword. He glanced at the sword and followed it right to the holder. It was then he saw the young man holding the sword, and heard him say, "If you don't mind, shoot that thing in the face before it puts its wings back in place." Edwin absently nodded and did as the man said. He was rewarded with a loud boom from the gun, and the creature's head exploding. He stood back as the creature then collapsed, and was surprised when the man started to hack at the creature with his sword. When he was done, Edwin looked at him and said, "Thank you for your help, but how did you get in here?" He glanced up, noticing the door he had entered the temple at was open, but could not see any signs that the man had followed him. He watched as the young man looked at him and said, "That will probably be explained in a bit. Right now, you need to open either the northern or southern door. The only way to do it is to place either bracelet or necklace on the statue on the western wall." He was startled that the man knew so much about the temple. It was almost as if the man had been here before. Edwin looked around for a moment and wanted to ask how the man knew that, but he then noticed a pile of dust in the center of the room. He pulled out his brush and started to get rid of the dirt. When the pile was gone, he saw a bronze bracelet covering an odd diagram. As he picked up the bracelet, he noticed that the man who had helped him was looking at the diagram. He looked at the man and said, "Do you know something about that pattern?" He watched the young man nod and say, "Yes, I do. The three runes in the triangle's points represent Chiturga, Zelatoth, and Ulioth. Each of them were imprisoned by Mantarok, who is represented by the purple rune. In fact, this temple is built over that particular ancient." He stepped back for a moment when he heard the man speak. He looked again at the bracelet and then over at the statue. As he walked over to it, he wondered how the man seemed to know so much about the temple. He placed the bracelet on the statue's one arm and heard the southern door open. As he walked over to it, he looked again at the man and swore he saw something familiar. Something also reminded him that the man had just saved his life, and he would need all the help he could get. He motioned for the man to join him and said, "Well, if we are supposed to be allies here, we might as well know each other's names. I'm Dr. Edwin Lindsay." He watched as the man nodded and said, "I know. My name is Richard Cale, Jr." That made him do a double take. He was sure that couldn't be true. His friend, Jean, had only just told him that her little boy had just turned 9 years old. There was no way this man could be her son. He then watched as the man headed to the southern door, saying, "We need to get moving." Edwin ran after the man and said, "Wait 1 minute. Are you telling the truth about who you are?" The second he hit the door, he felt disoriented and watched as the whole building changed around them. As he blinked, he saw the man looking around in confusion, and then saw him focus on another thing, on something behind him. Edwin turned and was stunned to see a red-headed woman standing behind him in mid-air. Yvette Cale watched as her husband and her father appeared in the surreal hall. When she saw them both appear, she noticed her husband was looking straight at her. She then watched as her father turned around to face her. She smiled at him and then lowered herself to the floor. She wondered if the tome of eternal darkness was allowing her to float when in this weird place. She then looked at her father, who appeared 20 years younger than when she last saw him, and said, "Hello, Father. Before her father could even say anything to object to it, she pulled out a locket and said, "Yes, it's really me. I still have Mom's locket." She watched as her father gasped, and then looked back at her husband and said, "It is you. But if you are all grown up, then that means that he really is Jean's boy. Why are you both? Why are the both of you here?" She then watched as he looked around again and said, "And where is here?" She watched as her husband started to look over all the statues in the room, and then said to her father, "It's a long story, Dad, but it's important. Many years ago, a Roman centurion named Pius Augustus became the tool of an ancient deity named Zelatoth. Since then, Pius has existed as an undead entity. Centuries ago, he cast a spell to bind the deity in this temple, but a woman from that time holds something that can help us stop the darkness that comes. My husband has been jumping back in time to help." She watched as her father looked at her husband and said, "You mean you two are married? How many years have passed from this point?" She started walking toward the tomb and said, "About 17 years. In that time, Richard and I got married. I now know why I see things. I'm actually seeing what is real. We are also helping a friend who found the book in their home. Their grandfather was killed because of this. We need to help stop this darkness." She watched as her father nodded and said, "I understand. You do know that your husband saved my life." When she nodded, she heard him say, "If there is something important, I will find it. I'm sure your husband will help as best he can. I will say that he might want to find something other than a sword to stop some of these things." She nodded and said, "Well, when we find a gun, we'll try to send it back with him. However, I think you need to grab the tome and head back." She then watched as the skeletal hand holding the book opened. As he went to grab the book, she saw him look at the statues again and heard him say, "By the way, who are all these statues of?" She watched as her husband walked over and said, "They are all the people who died or met an ill fate because of the book. There are 3 more positions, and I know none of them are for you." Before he grabbed the book, she watched as her father looked at Richard and said, "How do you know that, Richard?" She smiled as he grabbed the book and said, "Because you attended the wedding and gave me away." She saw a brief smile pass on his face as he and her husband returned to the temple in Cambodia. She then felt herself returning to the present, and she hoped that everything would be well with her and Alexandra. Richard Kale was thankful when they reappeared in the temple. When he was sure they were both back, he started heading south to the room of the setting sun. At least, if he remembered right, it was that room. When he entered the room, he was greeted by a few zombies in the room. He quickly rushed into action and started cutting off the heads of some of the zombies when he heard Edwin say, "Richard is all—" He then knew that Edwin noticed the zombies and hoped that he would realize what needed to be done. Soon he heard the sound of a blade cutting through a corpse. He glanced over and saw Edwin decapitating a corpse like he was doing. Soon he saw the last one fall, and he turned to Edwin and said, "Now, what were you about to ask?" He waited a moment while Edwin caught his breath and then said, "Was all what my daughter said true?" Richard nodded, and then Edwin said, "So you are Jean's son. How is she doing in the future?" Richard froze for a moment, not knowing what to say. He wasn't even sure he should mention to Edwin that his parents were dead. He was even leery about mentioning much else, afraid of what it would do to time. He knew his fears were a bit irrational, but decided that for now he wouldn't say. He then said, "Yes, my mother's name is Jean. Maybe later I'll tell you a bit more about the future. But right now we need to find Aaliyah." He then headed west into the trap hall and stopped. He watched as he saw a trapper start to move about the hall. He wondered how the creature had managed to survive in the hall without setting off any of the traps. Before he could think, he heard Edwin step in the hall and heard him say, "What is that creature?" Richard motioned for quiet, but it was too late. He saw the creature turn in their direction they were standing and watched as the creature moved forward. He watched as the creature stepped on one of the triggers and gasped as the blades in the hall started swinging. He was lucky he wasn't close to one of them, but smiled when the one blade cut the trapper in two. He then said to Edwin, "Jump between the blades and mind the odd-colored tiles." Richard began stepping between the blades and working his way to the other end of the hall. When he was past the traps, he saw Edwin taking the same steps. When he had cleared the traps, Richard looked at him and said, "That thing was a creature called a trapper. It's blind and responds to sound. It does a suicide attack that sends whatever it focuses on to another dimension." He watched as Edwin looked at the thing that used to be a trapper as it disappeared and said, You know, this is the sort of thing Yvette always said was around. I guess now is the first time I'm seeing these things." He then watched as Edwin looked over at a small podium and picked up the metal bracelet. He watched as Edwin looked it over and said, "Think it might come in handy?" He nodded and said, "Indeed. It seems that whatever we encounter here will be not only useful here, but even elsewhere." Richard then continued down the hall and stopped for a moment, almost in fright. He was staring at a huge spider web. He was scared of spiders. After seeing all the terrible creatures, his own fear of spiders had him frozen. He then watched as Edwin pulled out his brush and brushed the thing away, exposing a stone codex. He felt his fear subside when Edwin picked up the tablet and said, "Looks like a translation for a rune. Apparently, the engraved rune is called Tyr, which means summon." Richard then saw the codex disappear from Edwin's hands. Richard took a deep breath and said, "Let's get moving. The sooner we get to Aaliyah, the sooner we can get out of here." He then entered the next room and stopped moving. When he heard Edwin gasp behind him, he quietly said, "It's a horror, and I think it's not going to attack us. It's behind a barrier we can't cross. See the runes on the floor? It's a barrier of sorts." He then saw Edwin look to his left as he said, "Well, if it's behind a barrier, it's guarding something. And I don't think it is guarding this bronze necklace." Richard glanced over at where Edwin was reaching and saw him pick up the item. Richard turned his eyes back to the horror and saw it wasn't moving. Richard then said, "Let's head back to the statue. I don't want to chance that creature surprising us if this is a trick." He saw Edwin nod, and they worked their way back to the entrance room. As they walked, he heard Edwin say, "I take it that you've been here before." Richard nodded, and then he heard Edwin say, "Let me guess. The last time you were here, a girl named Aaliyah was here, and it is linked to the book that we found in that odd room." He nodded again, and he then heard Edwin Lindsay say, "So Aaliyah has something needed to stop the dark forces. What does she have?" Richard was about to answer that one when he noticed they were back in the room. He then said, "I'll tell you when we get closer. Right now, put the necklace on the statue." He watched as Edwin did so. As he heard the northern door open, he then rushed through the door and saw a silver bracelet. When he saw it in front of the three-headed snake statue, he couldn't believe it wasn't guarded. He started to reach for it when he started to have a nagging feeling about the whole scene. When Edwin entered the room, he saw Richard reaching for the silver bracelet and realized why it was just laying out in the open. He quickly ran over and grabbed Richard's hand and said, "Wait a second. Before you grab that necklace, look at the statue. Doesn't something seem odd?" He watched as Richard looked over the statue before saying, "It looks like the mouths are hollow, like something is in them." He nodded, and then watched as Richard said, "It's a trap. This must have been put in after Aaliyah was here." He looked at Richard and said, "That may be the case. And as we explore, you need to tell me about this Aaliyah, especially if we have to find her. But I do believe we need that bracelet. So here's what we will do. You take the silver bracelet, and I'll replace it with the metal bracelet." He watched as Richard nodded, and then they made the switch. When they did it, he heard the door start to lower and then raise again. He then grabbed a torch in the room and headed west into the new hallway. As they headed west, he saw Richard watching the panels and also heard him say, "I think we have some more zombies in the corridor." He watched as Richard went after the one zombie and rushed to get up to him. He could see that the one zombie was falling to Richard, but the other one was coming up right behind him. He quickly lunged forward with the torch and set the second creature ablaze. When the creatures were dead, he watched as Richard looked at the one that tried to attack him from behind, and he heard him say, "Thank you, Edwin. I didn't realize a creature was attacking me from behind." He watched as Richard then approached the creature to hack it to pieces. When he noticed another huge spider web, he made his way towards it and started to brush it away. He smiled when he found another codex. He picked it up and read the translation on it. He then said, "Richard, I found another codex. This one is the Nethlic Codex, or Dispel." He then watched as the codex disappeared. He waited as Richard walked over to him and said, "We have 2 codexes, which means we will have 2 runes coming up. Odds are that those runes will be stuck in creatures. I also wouldn't be surprised if we'll be using the Dispel rune soon." He then watched as Richard glanced into the next room. He watched as Richard turned to him and said, "Remember, aim for the neck with your sword." He watched as Richard ran into the next room and started to attack some of the zombies. He followed and attacked one zombie with a glowing rune in it. He quickly decapitated it and destroyed it. In that brief moment, he saw the rune disappear in yellow lightning, and heard the words he read only moments before. He then continued destroying zombies in the dark room. When they were done, he heard the doors open, and wasn't aware they had closed when they entered. When they opened, he said, "Looks like only one way to go." He watched as Richard nodded and said, "Yep, let's just hope there's a magic spell in the hall there. I just have a sneaky suspicion that the horror we saw earlier is guarding a silver necklace." He then watched as the young man headed south. He followed and watched as Richard chose his steps very carefully. About halfway down the hall, he saw something reach for Richard, and saw the man fall towards a statue like the one they saw earlier. He quickly ran down the hall, leaping over all the sets of trap panels, and quickly beheaded the zombie. He stopped and looked at Richard as the lad gasped. He carefully patted Richard on the shoulder and said, "Just take a moment and catch your breath." He then glanced at the statue and saw the traces of silver around the one wrist and around the neck. He then looked opposite the statue and saw another big web in the one corner of the alcove. He let past experiences guide him as he started to brush away the web. When he was done, he picked up the scroll and saw it was a magical spell. He watched as the scroll disappeared, and then opened the tome, only to find it there. He then looked at Richard and saw the man was recovering. He then said, "We found the magic spell. Do you think we should take on that horror, as you called it?" He looked down the hall as Richard nodded and said, "Yes, however, we should enchant our weapons first. A horror is a very powerful creature, and we'll need all the firepower we can get to stop it. Personally, I think that thing we fought earlier seemed more powerful. However, I didn't see it attack." He nodded and said, "I don't think it did complete an attack, but I'm glad it didn't. Now, how do you enchant things?" He watched as Richard flipped the pages in the book before him and pointed to a spell. He then nodded and recited the spell. Soon he saw his shotgun glowing with a red glow. He then saw Richard hold the book and cast the same spell. And he then saw Richard's sword was now glowing. He then said, "So, what's the plan?" He watched as Richard started to enter the room, as he said, "Dispel the barrier, I'll distract Big and Ugly, and you blast it with the shotgun. If we are lucky, the first blast will kill it before it attacks." As they entered and he saw the horror again, he said, "What if we aren't lucky?" He then watched as Richard moved to the far side of the creature. He then heard Richard say, "Then we will get a quick jolt of electricity. Now cast a dispel spell, and I'll keep him busy." Edwin did as Richard said and watched as the green barrier flickered and disappeared. He then watched as Richard attacked the creature. He was almost stunned when Richard's sword went right through the creature's one neck. He then aimed his shotgun as the creature turned to face its attacker and fired point blank into the creature. He then heard the creature release a loud roar and collapse dead. He watched as Richard grabbed the silver necklace and said, "Nice shot. Now let's see what this necklace reveals." He nodded and headed back to the statue. He watched as Richard placed the silver items in place and turned to see a doorway open right across from the statue. He smiled and said, "Something tells me that we found the path. Where do you think it leads?" He watched as Richard smiled and said, "Down, the slow way, but better than the trap door that let Aaliyah fall to the bomb floor. I just hope we reach the bottom from here." He nodded and led the way into the room. He was thankful he still had the torch, but was surprised to see that they were at the top of a large stairwell. He glanced down it and saw a zombie walking up it, and he could see another glowing rune in it. He then noticed Richard looking down over a ledge. As he started towards the zombie, he said, "What do you see, lad?" He felt his blood run cold as Richard said, "Another one of those winged creatures walking in a colored fog. Maybe you should use the enchanted gun on it, while I take care of the zombie." He nodded and rushed down the steps, making sure he had the shotgun ready. He then watched as the creature started to spread its wings. As it did so, he fired right at the creature's head. He lucked out as the creature fell. He then turned back to see Richard lopping off the zombie's head, and then saw the rune disappear. When he saw it do that, he heard from an unearthly voice that it was the Aratak rune. When that was done, he looked at Richard and said, "I think that all the creatures are gone. Why don't we get to the next floor?" He watched as Richard nodded, and they went to the bottom of the stairs. When they got there, he noticed a glowing yellow barrier around the door. As he approached it, he saw it disappear. As he neared it, he made sure his torch was in hand as he said, "Shall we continue the hunt for Aaliyah?" He turned to face Richard and saw the man who was married to his daughter in the future start to stagger. He then ran back to the lad and put his arm around him. He then looked at Richard and said, "Are you all right?" Richard felt Edwin grab him, but he couldn't focus on him at the moment. He was suffering one of his blink attacks. He closed his eyes and was thankful that when it happened, there were no creatures around. He slowly opened his eyes and looked at his sword. It was still glowing red. He then looked at Edwin and said, "I'm fine, but you look a bit startled." He watched as Edwin nodded and said, "Yes, I saw you stagger. And then, just as I grabbed you, I noticed that your sword is now glowing red. Before it was glowing blue. What happened?" He lowered his head and said, "It's been a problem all my life, and only now am I understanding it. Since we found the tome in the present, I understand more of what's happening, but apparently I'm jumping between timelines, where Pius chose different ancients. Luckily, everything else seems the same when I blink, as I called them." He started to stand on his own and said, "Now, we should move on. I hope we end up on the bottom level." He watched as Edwin stepped into the hall and said, "Well, I'm not sure if we are at the bottom, but it's another trap-filled hall." Richard stepped into the hall and saw Edwin was right. He looked north and south and sighed. He then heard Edwin respond to the sigh as he said, "Let me guess. We aren't at the bottom." Richard shook his head and said, "Nope. and I think we better be careful." He then heard some of the traps in the hall trigger. He glanced in the direction he heard the sound and saw a few zombies heading towards them. Before they could react to the threat, he saw blades cut the zombies in half. Richard let out a breath of relief as he said, "Well, that takes care of a few blades. Let's head north and get past the rest of these traps as carefully as possible." When they were about to enter the northern room, he saw Edwin stop and ready his shotgun. As he did so, he said, "I think I heard one of those horror creatures again. I'll go in first." Richard then watched as Edwin stepped into the room and fired his shotgun. He heard the gun fire again, and finally he heard the roar of a defeated horror. Richard ran into the room and saw Edwin holding the gun but gasping for breath. He walked over to Edwin and said, "Are you all right?" He watched as Edwin nodded and then heard him say, "Looks like the creature was guarding that floating red rune there, but I think something else is in here." He then walked over to the room, stopping short of the barrier. He glanced at it and saw it was the rune of Juturga. He realized what had to be done and said, "Edwin, can I have the tome for a moment?" He watched as Edwin tossed the book to him and said, "Go ahead. I'm just about to check out this web in the corner. I think something is under it." Richard caught the book and then turned to face the pedestal the rune was on. He quickly turned to the page with the Dispel magic spell and cast it using Uliol's rune. He watched as the barrier disappeared, and then the rune disappeared. When both were gone, Richard heard a sound like a barrier falling, echoing through out the floor. He then said, "Edwin, I think we found another secret in this temple. Did you find anything?" He turned to see Edwin holding up a necklace covered in something. He then heard Edwin say, "I know there is a necklace under all this stuff. We just have to find something to clean it with. Do you think that was all in the room?" Richard shook his head and leaned back against the west wall, and was surprised to feel it moving. When he glanced at Edwin, he saw Edwin running for the eastern door, shouting, "Let's move before whatever that triggered goes into motion." Richard ran after Edwin and into the hall, running east. He was running so fast that he didn't realize he was stepping on the panels that triggered the traps. He was even more surprised when none started. He then said, "Edwin, the panel I pressed must have temporarily disarmed the traps on this floor." He then saw the one zombie in the hall start to rise. He shouted, "Let's not fight that thing, just get past it." He heard Edwin shout, "I agree." He then saw Edwin run into the next room and heard the man shout, "Richard, have your sword ready." He started to wonder why Edwin said that, and realized why when he saw Edwin fighting a zombie. He turned to face another zombie and quickly destroyed the rotting corpse. When that was done, he heard Edwin say, "Looks like we have another one of those barriers here." Richard looked at the green rune and said, "That's the rune associated with Zelatoth. That means we will have to cast a spell using Juturga's rune. Once you do that, I'll push the panel that looks like the one I pushed earlier. Then we head south." He watched as Edwin nodded and then cast the spell. When the rune disappeared, and he heard the echoing sound of a barrier falling, He pushed the panel. He then followed Edwin down the southern hall. As they were running, he noticed that Edwin was holding the torch and touching it to the zombies that started to rise. He noticed that Edwin was stopping halfway down the hall and heard him say, "I think we found the home for our necklace. It's another statue, which means another stairway is here." Richard glanced at the wall opposite the statue and smiled, realizing it was another hidden stairwell. He then heard Edwin say, "And it looks like flecks of gold are on this statue. I think that means that our necklace is actually gold under all the stuff." He nodded and said, "Makes sense. Now let's head south of here. We also should be careful. I think the traps will be active again." They then continued down the hall, avoiding all the traps in the hall. When they reached the end and entered the southern room, he saw Edwin torch a zombie that was waiting for them. When he entered the room, he held his nose for a moment. He then said, "Good grief. There is some sort of acidic smell in the air." He watched as Edwin walked over to a huge statue that had a sort of button in front of it, as he said, "We have a primitive sink basin here. How much you want to bet this has an acid in it?" He then watched as Edwin put the necklace in the basin and pushed the button. He watched as the fluid filled the basin, and he heard a hissing sound. Richard spun around briefly, keeping an eye out for any of the bone thieves he had encountered before, and then relaxed. He then noticed the rune of Ulioth on the podium and said, "Can you hand me the tome again? This might be the last rune set up like this." He watched as Edwin tossed him the book, and he cast the Dispel Magic spell again. He was stunned when he heard the sound he heard before, but louder this time. He then looked down the western hall and said, "Edwin, I think we might be near the source of that sound. Maybe we will find what those runes kept hidden." He then heard Edwin say, "Yes." He looked over at Edwin and saw him holding up a gold necklace. Edwin had been right about the necklace. He then heard Edwin say, "You might be right. I bet the runes were hiding the gold bracelet, or something even more valuable." He then started to head towards the western hall. As he saw Edwin do that, Richard ran over to the wall and pushed the panel. He then followed Edwin, and they started to run through the hall. As they did, Richard noticed a dog-sized hole in the northern wall. As they passed it, something nagged at him about it. He was sure that had been where the barrier had been. He then reached the end of the hall and saw Edwin looking at a statue. It was facing away from them, looking at two hands apparently holding something. Richard then said, "Do you see something, Edwin?" He then heard Edwin say, "Yes, we need to get this statue facing away from the hands. The hands are holding the bracelet." Richard understood what Edwin was asking for. He started to head towards the statue and felt the floor sink. He then heard the statue start to turn and saw it turning to face him. He froze and heard Edwin say, "That's it. Richard, stay there until the statue is almost facing you." He waited as the statue turned and saw it was almost facing him. Soon he saw Edwin grab something and then ran over to the wall and pushed the panel on the wall as he said, "Now, back to the statue in the eastern hall." Richard didn't have to be told twice. He quickly got off the panel and ran after Edwin. They ran quickly through the halls, avoiding the traps, and made their way to the statue. When they finally stopped, he said, "All right, Edwin, now what?" He watched as Edwin placed the gold items on the statue, and then heard the wall open up. He saw the smile on Edwin's face, and Richard said, "When they built this place, they were sneaky, weren't they?" He saw Edwin nod as he said, "I've seen it in a lot in old temples. They hold many secrets." He then saw Edwin look in shock as he said, "But this is the weirdest by far." Richard turned to look through the door and gasped as it appeared they were looking at Alexander Roivas. It was almost surreal. Alexander Roivas looked over the tome and felt a slight chill next to her. She glanced up and noticed that Yvette wasn't in the room. She then glanced over her left shoulder. She was looking into the face of her grandfather. As she was facing him, she heard him say, "Remember me, Alex?" She could hear the pleading tone in his voice. She looked at him and realized how much she missed him. She felt like a lost child when she said, "I always remember you. You meant so much to me, ever since my parents died." She then watched as he looked at her and said, "Yes, ever since they died, you've been my little girl." She looked back at the book and started to wonder if she could ask him about the tome. As she looked at it, she could swear he was saying, "My little girl." She wondered if it was her mind playing tricks, but something didn't seem right about the tone. It was then that she heard the door to the room open, and she heard Yvette shout, "Get away from here!" She turned to look at where her grandfather's ghost was and saw it was gone. She then heard Yvette say, "Did he do anything to you? Are you all right?" Alexander was surprised by Yvette's question, and then saw the worry in her eyes. She then started to worry if she actually saw her grandfather. Edwin stared in puzzled fascination at the scene as it played out, but when it ended he started to wonder if he had seen it at all. He then turned to face Richard and asked, "What did we just see?" He watched as Richard stepped towards the door and said, "We just saw the future, or to me, the present. The woman in the chair is Alexander Roivas. The ghost was apparently her grandfather, Edward Roivas. But judging by Yvette's reaction, that might not be the case. What makes it even harder is that she lost her grandfather 2 weeks ago." He took in those words as he followed Richard into the stairwell and said, "It can be hard to lose a loved one. Not too long ago I lost my wife. As you can imagine, it was hard for Yvette as well." He watched as Richard looked over the edge of the balcony and said, "I know. She helped me through a rough time after we got married." He then watched as Richard froze and then looked at him. In the man's eyes he saw two things. First was fear of something tangible, and that meant more creatures. Then he saw in Richard's eyes a fear of something that couldn't be touched. In that moment it hit him. He looked at Richard and said, "Jean and her husband are dead, aren't they?" He watched as his ally nodded. "Relax, Richard. I know it must still hurt, but we need our wits about us right now. If you are worried I might tell them, don't worry. Besides, it may be hard for them to swallow that their 9-year-old boy helped me in Cambodia." He noticed that Richard relaxed a little, and he then lifted his shotgun and said, "Now, I take it there are some creatures waiting for us?" He watched as Richard nodded and said, "Some zombies and a horror. I'll take out the zombies if that's all right with you." He nodded and then watched as Richard ran down the steps. He then made his way down the steps and took aim at the horror as it started to focus on Richard. He was glad his gun was still enchanted as he fired it right at the horror. He watched as the creature howled in pain, and he fired again. Soon he saw the creature collapse, and he saw that Richard was killing the last of the zombies. When the last creature fell, he heard Richard say, "I hope this is the last floor." He smiled and said, "I hope so too. However, if this is the last floor, things may be harder. I just hope my ammo holds out." He watched as Richard nodded in agreement, and then led the way into the hall beyond. As they entered the trap-filled hall, he heard Richard say, "This seems a bit familiar, but we are heading north. If this is the bottom floor, they added to it since Aaliyah was here." He then saw Richard being very careful about where he stepped. He looked along the walls and noticed that some of the wall panels looked remarkably different, and realized that some of the walls closed on people when they hit the wrong panel. When they reached the end of the hall, he noticed Richard was starting to attack some zombies. He watched as Richard dispatched the zombies, and then noticed the mural on the wall. When he heard Richard destroy the last zombie, he said, "Richard, come here. I think the mural details the arrival of an ancient god." He watched as Richard looked at the mural and heard him say, "Yes, I think this is supposed to be Mantarok arriving on Earth. It's a good likeness." He wondered what Richard meant by that, and then saw a large web. He started to brush it away and found another codex. He picked it up and looked at it before saying, "Well, Richard, we have found the codex for Aratak, or creature. Did we find that rune already?" He watched as Richard took out the tome and looked at it and said, "Yes, I think the only rune we need to find is the one called Tear. Now, shall we continue on?" He nodded, and they then continued west. As they quickly made their way west, he saw Richard point towards a zombie. He quickly lit the thing on fire with his torch and continued following Richard to the next room. When they reached the next mirror room, he saw Richard start to attack some of the zombies. He started attacking other zombies with his own blade, and was thankful when the last one fell. When that was done, he looked up at the mural in the room and saw all the locals praising the odd creature in the previous mural. He made the only conclusion, and then said to Richard, "I think it's time to head south." He watched as Richard nodded, and then ran south. He quickly followed and saw Richard rushing through the hall, jumping over all the obvious traps. As they continued down the hall, he heard Richard say, "Now we are in familiar territory. This is the hall Aaliyah fell into. That means we aren't too far away from the final chamber." He then followed Richard into another mural room and saw Richard glance at all the zombies and said, "That one over there has our last rune." He nodded and ran over with his blade in hand and said, Let's wipe them out and then find out what this room has to say. He then attacked the zombie with the rune in it. When he managed to lop off that zombie's head, he saw the rune disappear in a flash of yellow lightning. He heard the words that were the rune as it disappeared, and then turned to help Richard destroy the remaining zombies. When they were done, he glanced at the mural and saw the image of Paul Augustine's alternate form talking to the people. It was then that he heard Richard gasp in shock. Richard looked on at the mural and gasped in shock. This area had been constructed before the events they portrayed. He then remembered the odd purple rune and how Yvette still seemed to see it. Things just appeared to fall into place, but he wasn't entirely sure his line of thinking was right. He then heard Edwin say, "Richard, what's wrong?" He turned to face Edwin and said, "I think the murals are predicting events that were going to happen after the place was built. I didn't pay much attention to them last time, but now the murals all make sense. There's just one thing that bothers me about it all." He saw Edwin give him a questioning look, and he just said, "Right now, I'd rather not voice my concerns, but a few years down the line I will." He saw Edwin nod, and then motion to a yellow barrier on the eastern wall. He then heard Edwin say, "Shall we check out the next room?" When he nodded, he watched as Edwin approached the barrier and saw it disappear. He then heard Edwin say, "Looks like we have the right key." Richard nodded and said, "Let's go. This should be the last trap hall we encounter." He then followed Edwin through the hall, dodging every trap in the hall. When they made it through the hall, he saw they reached the final mural room. He reacted at once when he saw the zombies. He jumped into the room and started cutting off their heads. He also saw Edwin doing the same thing and knew they would have eliminated all the zombies in short order. When they were done, he watched as Edwin looked at the mural that depicted the binding of Mantarok. He watched as Edwin looked at it and said, "So, Paul did something to this deity, Mantarok as you call him. How did Paul manage to do that to Mantarok? Did he get help from that Chaturga being?" He started to walk around the room and noticed a piece of paper as he said, "Yes, he did have help from Chaturga, but from what we've been able to figure, Mantarok had sealed away Chaturga, Zelatoth, and Ulioth. I wouldn't think that they would be powerful enough to do anything to Mantarok." He then looked over the paper and realized it was a spell. He read it again before it disappeared and smiled. He then said, "I think we need to head back upstairs. Something tells me we need to explore that hole in the wall." He then started back the way they came. As he made his way through the halls, he heard Edwin say, "Richard, what are you going on about? Why are we heading back to the upstairs hall?" As they ran, Richard just said, "Remember that hole in the wall? I think it was just big enough to let a small dog through. I bet a trapper could run through it. The spell we just found will summon a trapper, one that we can control." At this point, they had just started up the stairs. He then heard Edwin say, "You think something important is in that hole. Want to give me the heads up on your suspicions?" It was at that point that they reached the top of the stairs and headed for the wall with the hole in it. As they ran, Richard said, "In the past 3 chapters, an alignment rune was found. However, We've never run across a rune for Mantarok. I bet that hole hides some clue to the alignment rune. He finally stopped just in front of the hole. He looked down to try to gaze in the hole again, and then listened for a moment. As he listened, he heard Edwin look at him and then say, "Something in there?" Richard nodded, and heard Edwin say, "How about this? I enchant my shotgun. Then you summon the trapper and find out what's in that hole." Richard nodded and saw Edwin enchant his gun. He then held the tome, and cast the summon trapper spell, and watched as the trapper appeared in front of him. He then made it enter the hole, and in that moment he could see the room. He watched as the creature walked along and saw two horrors in the room. He also saw a bridge and made the creature cross it. When it had reached the other side, he saw a circular panel with a rune on it. When he had the trapper step on it, he heard something open. He then released control of the trapper. When he stood up, he turned to see a glowing purple rune in a hidden alcove. He then said, "I believe we found Mantarok's rune. Hand me the tome for a moment, Lindsay." He watched as Edwin handed him the book, and he quickly set up a damage field for when the horrors came out. He then said, "Okay, hand me the shotgun and your revolver, then grab the rune." He took the guns when Edwin offered them, and then turned to face the wall. He took aim as Edwin said, "I hope you know what you're doing." He watched as the wall as he heard the rune disappear. He knew Edwin had claimed it, especially when one of the horrors burst through the wall. He quickly fired the shotgun at point-blank range. He then started forward and said, "One horror and one trapper to go. Come on, Edwin." He then ran into the room and stopped in time to shoot another horror. The only good thing was it couldn't come and get them. He then aimed and killed the trapper with a well-placed shot. When he was done, he just said, "Thank goodness my father taught me how to handle guns." Richard turned to see Edwin nod as he said, "Indeed. Now I think I see a huge stone behind that cobweb over there." He watched as Edwin crossed the bridge and started dusting at the spiderweb. He wasn't surprised to see a large codex for Mantarok behind the web. He then heard Edwin say, "Looks like we've got everything. Shall we head back to the last mural room?" When he nodded, they headed down there in silence. He knew it would be a long walk, but it went easy. There were no creatures running around the temple now. As they walked, Richard started to wonder about what Pius might have done. He also started to wonder if Pius was actually serving Chaturga, or whatever ancient it was. Before he could even try to speculate, he realized they were in the last mural room. He then looked at Edwin before heading north and said, "Take this as fair warning. But Mantarok is not a pretty sight." He watched as Edwin nodded an acknowledgement, and then followed as they walked towards Mantarok. As they entered the huge chamber, he could have sworn that someone was behind them. As they neared the statue in the room, Richard heard a voice say, "The power of Mantarok is not easily controlled." He turned and saw Pius there. As they faced him, he heard Edwin say, "What makes you think I want to control it? I don't think you can handle it, Paul." He had to admire Edwin's bravery. He shivered then when Pius said, I don't think you'll have to worry about that. In fact, you and your meddlesome friend won't have to worry. He then saw two guardians start to advance. As they advanced, he heard Pius say, "You may have escaped my grasp 9 times prior, boy, but this time you will not stop me." He was ready to defend himself when he heard a crackle of energy. He took a moment to glance back and saw purple lightning lash out and strike Pius and the two guardians. He then heard Pius yell in pain and saw the guardians disappear. He then glanced at Pius and said, "Looks like you're wrong, Pius." Richard then saw Pius stagger off and saw him disappear as he said, "The darkness will come. You cannot stop it." He then relaxed when he realized that Pius was gone. He then almost jumped when he heard what sounded like a stone slab opening. When it stopped, he knew what had happened. He then started to run around the circular platform that rested on top of Madrock towards the rear door. As he ran, he heard Edwin following him saying, "Richard, where are we going?" Before he could respond, he heard a female voice say, "It is you. I heard you out there. Did you bring someone to take the heart to the gathering of light?" When they reached the small room, he heard Edwin gasp as they gazed upon Elia's withered corpse. He then heard Elia address Edwin, saying, "Be careful, flesh and bone. Do not directly touch the heart of Mantarok. You need to take it to the gathering of light. Only the chosen one will know how to stop the coming darkness. The man next to you can tell you where to take it." It was then he saw the corpse reach into its own chest and pull out the heart of Mantarok. He watched as Edwin pulled out a cloth and wrapped the heart up. He then saw Edwin turn to him and ask, "All right, where do I take this thing?" Richard looked at Edwin and said, "Take it to Dr. Edward Roivas. He lives in Rhode Island in the United States. You won't have any trouble getting out of here. I think you realize why." He watched as Edwin nodded in understanding, and then ran out of the room. As Edwin left, he saw the world dissolve around him, and saw the study filling his view again. He then realized that he survived another chapter. He also knew that he was going to survive the other chapters in the book as well.